Last month, you said the topic that we want to hear about is how to regain lapsed donors. So lapsed donors is the theme of the month. Broke that into two categories. One is how to find the donors that are going to be lapsed. And the second is once they're lapsed, how do we get them? So this was a fun little literature search. A couple of these things we've covered on previous test of the months, but a little bit of a different spin on them talking about the lapse side of things. So in terms of finding new donors, we are looking at who lapsed. And so there was a major national nonprofit. They were looking at 4 years of records, starting off $100 and below donors, and they wanted to see what was predictive of lapsing. So researchers looked in at just the monetary level. So if I look at recency, if I look at frequency, if I look at amount. So frequency of giving in that first year, highly predictive, as you might guess. So lapsing rates of 0.7%. If they gave one gift, 0.45%. If the person gave more than one gift in that first year, and that continues through fiscal year 3, fiscal year 4. There's a 39% lower likelihood of lapsing if the supporter gives 2 gifts or more in that first year. The gift amount, not as predictive. So they found that one logarithmic unit, which is, a 0. So from $10 versus $1, $100 versus $10, that predicted 4% of the decrease in lapse likelihood in subsequent years. So not wholly predictive. And then looking at the amount of solicitation that people get, you can see the regression coefficient here. They found that if you have increased amount of solicitation, when you controlled for gift numbers, if you controlled for dollar amounts, people who received one additional donation appeal were on average 8% less likely to lapse. There was another study that found that too many solicitations can lead to numbing. And so there's probably a bit of a parabola in this. There's a sweet spot, but adding in something worth testing. So the researchers then thankfully looked at this in rougher economic times, which probably parallels a little bit more what we're talking about here, although with a name like the Great Recession, one would hope it's not repeated. So they looked at giving in 2007 and said who gave in subsequent years. A lot of the same factors were predictive. If you gave more than one gift, you are 59% less likely to lapse in the 3 subsequent years. And 1-0 in the average gift amount predicted 13% less likely lapsing. So both were predictive factors in this. There was another study of why people lapse out of the face-to-face environment. The quick version is that lapsed donors are younger. They feel like they experienced pressure at that point of acquisition. So asking about things like satisfaction with the experience can be extremely predictive. And then if you're less happy with the quality of ongoing communication, obviously you're more likely to lapse. Now, these are not the only predictive variables. They were just a couple of the interesting studies that were out there. As we'll talk about later on, they're building this robust data stew that helps predict lapsing is a really important part of preventing people from lapsing. So the thing that you were really asking about is how do we get people back? Once someone is lapsed, how do we bring them back into the fold? And we have a question in the chat. It would be interesting to test that lapsing number of solicitations in conjunction with the donor satisfaction survey. She's remembering a test some time ago demonstrating that people who were more committed to the cause were more likely to lapse if they got too many solicitations and vice versa. I don't know if this is the particular study, but I want to say UNICEF, Italy. It was an international charity in Italy. And they looked at the number of solicitations that were in a welcome series, no ask solicitation, sorry, not solicitations, cultivation pieces. And they were randomized to 0 cultivation solicitation, 6 and 12. First finding, no one wanted 12. 12 was too many. But then they looked at 0 versus 6, and people who were committed to the organization already, people who already felt like they knew a lot about the organization, retained better when they got 0 cultivation solicitations. I already know this information, or I believe I know this information. I don't need it. It doesn't cause me to want to give, and it makes me question why I'm getting so much stuff from you. On the flip side, people who didn't know as much about the organization benefited from those additional 6 cultivation touch points because they were still in the learning phase. And so that's probably she says that's probably the one she's thinking of. It's been a while since she looked at it. Me too, it's been a couple of years, but that is my best recollection. And I think the differences in retention rate were somewhere along the 8 to 11% range. So good indication of you want to be breaking down people by various categories. And in fact, that's going to be a key thing. It's point number 2 in this, in terms of how to get them back. Trying to figure out how are my lapse donors different from my current donors and what do they react to differently. A few good studies in that realm. So the first idea of how to build donor identity is to get donors back in is to build this donor identity and build the tie to you. And this is interesting because it's kind of tangential. The study is from a, quote, Southeastern United States university. The researchers are from University of Tennessee. So I have a pretty good guess of which university they're talking about. And this is interesting because I felt myself in the study. I'm a Vandy grad. We're 180 miles down the road from UT. And so we very easily could be the secondary rival in this study. So what they did is they asked lapse donors to the university, here's a survey, please donate to the university. Then they put in 2 different rivals in their football team. The email for the secondary rival advertised an upcoming football game against a close university, but not a primary rival, the people that you get up in the morning to beat. The primary rival was one that was identified by most of the people surveyed as the primary rival. And they wanted to see if having this, and I'm going to call it an enemy because I think that generalizes a little bit better to a lot of the organizations that we're talking about. Some of our organizations have an actual enemy organization, with Mothers, when I was at Mothers Against Drunk Driving, we had organizations that were lobbying specifically against us. And so there's a good counterpoint there. But that can also be the disease itself, cancer is our enemy, those sorts of things help build donor identity. And so they measured donor intention rates and they found that people were more likely to say they wanted to donate if they got the primary rival, the secondary rival was second, and not having that oppositional force had the lowest donor intention rate. And then they also measured and said that they asked, how is your identification with the university? And the people who heard about a rival were more likely to say, yes, I believe I am a part of this university, I identify with it. And that was the most predictive variable for giving intent. And so there's this moderating effect. It wasn't necessarily that we have an enemy, it was that the enemy made you more likely to support the university, and identifying with the university is more likely to cause this giving intent. So the lessons here for non-university nonprofits, which is most of the folks on the call, is that it helps to have this kind of enemy, this oppositional force that you're going against. And even for those lapsed donors, people who have not given, there is an identity play. There's this idea of, I am connected to the organization, because a lot of lapsed folks don't realize they've lapsed. And so knowing this is very helpful to be able to say, you are this type of person that does this type of thing. We have this oppositional force out there. Can you help in this time of need? So another one is, teased this earlier, what are the differences between your current and lapsed donors? And so starting off with asking the idea of, do you send an ask in a thank you note? So this is an Indian nonprofit called Help Age. And every January they send this thank you letter to 200,000 donors. And so they broke folks down into 5 experimental treatments. Do you have a mail-in form? Do you ask for a Facebook like? And do you have a donation call to action? And so if it's just thank you so much, and by the way, here's a form, that's donation reminder, reminding that you had made a donation and thank you for that, but you're not actually doing an ask. With the CTA, they ask for a donation. They also ask for Facebook likes. They ask for both of them at the same time, and then they ask for Facebook no form, which you would predict did the worst, and it did the worst. There were some people who, even when there was no reply form and there was no donation ask, still donated, about a 0.3% response rate. But it's not the one you try, not the technique you try. And so generally they found that having an ask for additional donations reduced response rates. Having a Facebook ask definitely reduced response rates. And so that's interesting. Just the reminder and the thank you was enough to get more donations than any of the other treatments. However, okay, I promise we're not going to go through these numbers. Let's summarize. So they found that there were 2 very different reactions. The people who were less likely to donate when thanked and asked at the same time were recent donors, they were frequent donors, they were higher average gift donors. They were the people getting the thank you note who already give and give generously. And so for those people, putting a CTA in there dropped the response rate because it, diluted the purity of the thank you. Lapse donors, infrequent donors, smaller donors were more likely to donate when there was a call to action there. These are the people who haven't donated in a while. They're thanked for their previous support, but they're not actively involved. And so the question is, if you're making a task to your lapsed donor, you're thanking them for a gift they made some time ago, yes, they thank their donors across the board every January. And so if the person made a gift 2 years ago, they're thanking for that gift. And that is an effective tactic for them when the call to action is included. Looking back at these response rates, if you could get a 0.5% response rate to your fairly deeply lapsed donors with a thank you note, yeah, that's a pretty good piece. I mean, that's likely doing as well as your acquisition. Now, I'm not talking average gift here because it's all in rupees. It's difficult to kind of correlate with the things that we're used to. But so we're looking at response rate, and that's what we're looking at for trying to get our lapsed donors in as well. We're basically looking for them to come back in and not too worried about what their gift is at that point. We can fix average gift later once they're in our big warm hug. They found this was true across online and offline. So tasking different between our current donors and your lapsed donors. I should specify that as with all of these studies, your mileage may vary. I have found some circumstances where active donors, not necessarily frequent donors, but active donors in the last 12 months will react fairly well to a thank and an ask at the same time. And that taking that out does reduce revenues. So approach with some caution, but just want to get you thinking about some things that may be different in their treatment here. Telling people they are lapsed is another thing that works. Adding in this identity condition of putting in the date of your previous gift tends to, if someone gave a gift very recently, that can tend to suppress response rate. But when doing it for lapsed donors, they found that there was a substantial increase when the date of the last gift was put on the appeal. So you can bump that up by saying, here's when your last gift was. Kind of a similar thing to what we just saw, where you're reminding people of their previous support. Generally a good tactic for lapsed folks. Matches also, interestingly, work differently or can work differently. Don't want to be too broad. Can work differently between those who are active and those are lapsed. So these researchers put in 4 different treatments: match with urgency, match no urgency, no match with urgency, no match with no urgency, and they skipped the no woman, no cry treatment. That was the one that they axed there. But the urgency was a kind of, and I hesitate to criticize researchers, but researchers do a really good job, but they're not practitioners. And we would go in and say, if you're doing urgency, you have to give kind of a reason why you're doing urgency. They put, now is the time to give on the envelope in all caps. So take the urgency part with a grain of salt. And in fact, as you might, matches were also divided. They did 1-to-1 and 1-to-3 matches. They did different deadlines and they did different framings of it, whether it's your dollar will triple or your $25 will triple. So they got an even bigger chart of data. Urgency was generally irrelevant, except for the times that it did harm. So we can put that aside. The match generally worked across its different lapse conditions, but it only worked for current donors. And it was about a 3% increase in response rate, and there was a slight increase in average gift as well. Lapse donors who were getting match messaging were less likely to donate. And so just an interesting difference in how people reacted to those match packages. And so something that, these are 3 examples, but by no means are they the only examples of how your active and your lapse people are probably going to be reacting differently. And so what you can do to find good lapse techniques is, there are probably times that you have mailed, emailed, advertised, all of these sort of different channels. You're active and your lapse folks simultaneously. And so if you find similar groups, 0 to 6 month versus 13 to 18 month, let's say, as your indicator of active versus lapsed, your mileage may vary for that. And we'll talk a little bit about whether financial should be the only metric there. But chances are you'll look at that and go, okay, my active 0 to 6 month donors are 4 times more likely, and I'm making up a number here, to donate than my 13 to 18 month donors. So now you can look at all of the treatments that you've sent to them as, here's this package where my active donors were only twice as likely to donate than my lapsed ones. That's clearly either a bad technique for my active folks, or it's a really good technique for my lapsed folks, and vice versa. There may be something that you thought would help reactivate lapsed donors, but if your active is 10 times your lapsed, that ratio can give you a really good indicator of what you've already done, what tests you've already done, what packages you've already sent, what emails you've already committed to. It can help you back test and look at what are promising techniques for bringing our lapsed folks back into the fold. Third one, I think we've talked about this before, but it's an interesting study. It does look only at lapsed donors. My gut feeling is this is probably one that also works for active donors. But since it was lapsed donors, I wanted to throw it in here. Do people give more as they approach a goal? You're probably thinking, of course they do. I have seen the end of a race once in my life. That last little bit, people are pushing to get that additional time. And in fact, if you look at marathon times, you'll see a lot of people grouped at 2 hours and 59 minutes, 3 hours and 59 minutes, 4 hours and 59 minutes, out to me where I'm like 7 hours and 59 minutes. And then 3 hours, 1 minute, there's this huge gap. And it's because people have that goal and they're looking to achieve it. Same sort of thing here. This is a mailing to lapsed donors. They did match controls where they say, we're trying to raise money for a generator versus we're going to raise money for a generator and we're 10% of the way to the goal. And so they're looking at 3 different goals. They're looking at 3 different levels of money already raised. And it turns out that 85% was the motivating factor here. Now, the reason I think this probably works for active donors as well is there's a study from, I believe it's Kiva, one of the crowdfunders, that they found that people are more likely to give when they're 66 to 100% of the goal than they are at 33% to 66% of the goal, who are more likely to give than if you're 0 to 33% of the goal. Winners win in this case. And so this idea that we are 85% of the goal, can you push us over, increased donation rate by more than 100% for lapsed donors. So that's a really interesting technique. And you can take some of the things that you're already doing with your active population and say, oh, that piece didn't work as well. We got only 85% of the way to where we were supposed to be. Let's contact our lapsed folks and have them fill that gap. Fourth thing that you can do is remember your goals. We've talked a little bit about matching, but this is a fascinating match study that looks at 5 different ways of doing a match and a control. So there's control, there's a lead donor. Some generous donors already given a significant portion of the program, kind of what we saw with gold proximity before, a 50% match, 100% match. And then there are the weirdos. There's nonlinear matching, which says we'll match anything that happens over 50 euros. So if you give 120 euros, they'll match 70. And then there's fixed gift matching. Any gift you make, this person's going to match 20 euros of his own. So if you make a €1 gift, you're really making a 20 euro gift. And the reason that that's interesting is normally you'd look at this and say, okay, revenue per piece, that is my North Star, that is my goal. Lead donor's the way to go. Slightly lower response rate, but man, that average gift, there's not the crowding out effect that you have with a match. In fact, we've talked in previous test of the months, if you do a lead donor and say the lead donor has covered the overhead for this program, you can have an even more successful program. But remember your goal. With a lapsed donor, your goal is get them back in, get them back engaged with the organization. And so you might take something that suppresses average gift, but spikes response rate in that fixed gift match, where any donation you make, 20 bucks comes in, euros in this case, bucks for us. Even though it has the second lowest revenue per piece, that can be an effective lapsed donor reactivation strategy. Similarly, you can get into the same sorts of things in ask strings, where you're saying, maybe let's not go off of their highest previous contribution. Let's bring that down to an average contribution. Let's bring that down to the most recent contribution, because our goal is to bring them back into the program. And so thinking about that will find you some winners in your past that aren't winners now. Then finally, we've talked all about lapsed donors, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say, what if there aren't any lapsed donors? Which is to say, we put these artificial boundaries on people. And let's say you're at an organization that says someone lapses at 24 months. After that, they're a lapsed donor before they're in it. Who's more likely to donate and more valuable? Someone who's given 20 gifts of $100, they've been inactive for 25 months, or someone who's a single donor of $5 who gave it 23 months ago. It's almost always going to be that 25-month donor, even though it's been longer. What about someone who has a direct tie to your mission versus someone who doesn't have a direct tie to your mission? Their child was treated at your hospital, they suffer from a disease you are talking about, they themselves have an experience with poverty, they volunteered with your organization, and on and on and on. All of these great data points, all of which go into that wonderful data stew that we talk about. And so what if the idea of a lapsed donor is still helpful for some things? We want to keep bringing people back into the mission, but it may not be helpful because the person who gave one gift 7 months ago could be more likely to never give another gift to your organization than someone who's 30 months lapsed, just based on who they are, their financial situation, their identity, their demographics, the way that you're appealing to it, all of the things that go into this. So a pitch for a more subtle, modeled solution for looking at different types of donors. And we have a great opportunity to do some things that cross-cut, some things that this is a technique that works for all parents versus non-parents. And it doesn't matter if they're active or lapsed, we send them this parent package. We send them this, I've had experience with poverty package. We send them this, I have type 2 diabetes, so I'm looking for health tips rather than prevention tips. Those levels of customization can work across active and lapsed, thus be very effective. That's a lot of studies. Went pretty quick, so shout out any questions as you have them. As you heard, this topic was from, as they say in the PBS programming, came from viewers like you, came from folks here in the audience. So please let me know what types of topics you would like to hear. Would also love to hear about tests that you are doing. As I mentioned, these are really great academic studies, and we're glad that academics are studying this. But there are things that we kind of know as truisms, things that we would phrase, avenues that we would take that academics don't take into effect. And so there can be this really productive dialogue between those who are the practitioners and those in academia and their studies. So short version of that is, would love to hear topics, would love to hear if you have tests that you would like to share with the group. We've had some great folks sharing great studies already. Would love to keep that ball rolling. If you'd like to reach out, my email address is nellinger, that's NELLINGER, at wearemore, that's more with 2 O's.com. Would love to hear from you. I'm also always on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out there as well. And seeing no questions, hope your efforts to renew those lapse donors go really well. We know that renewed lapse donors tend to be higher retention, higher average gift than newly acquired folks. And so there are a lot of organizations that are over-investing in new, under-investing in renewing lapse donors. So love to see the interest in the topic here. Hopefully these are some helpful techniques. Thank you so much for your time today, and reach out if you have anything. Otherwise, I'll see you next month. Thank you.